Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And we have like the greatest spot of all, which is the afternoon slot. So where you are very well prepared for our presentation. So like Anthony said, my name's Sinead and this is my colleague Johanna. We are from the Environment Protection Authority, specifically the ETS operations scheme team. We are in charge of administering the ETS scheme and also processing a lot of applications, answering queries, and doing all of the reporting and market kind of public reports as well. So we've kind of split the presentation into two sections. So the first one is just like a brief overview, just to kind of like get some background in where we come from, and then more specifically for you guys as well, talking about industrial allocations. And then Johanna will go through like a practical example of how to apply for an application. If that is helpful, we can also like skip past that and go on to a Q&A as well, because I'm sure you have some questions and hopefully we'll have some answers. So great, just quick hand raise poll. How many of you are currently registered for the ETS? 1, 2, great. Fantastic. So the ETS is our primary method for climate control in New Zealand. It's our long-term commitment to reduce greenhouse gases. So how do we do this? It's a market cap system. We put price on carbon units and exchange them, trade them, and surrender them from participants. It's basically stems from the Kyoto Agreement back in 2008, and then the ETS was set up in 2010 with our first register, and we're currently on our second version of the register from about 2016. So for the two of you that are registered for the ETS, depending how long ago you registered, we have changed it slightly. But yeah, just to give a little bit background, this is how very simply the emissions trading scheme works. The New Zealand government gives out units to 4 different categories of people. We have forestries, removal activities, industrial allocations, and also they sell units at auctions. So this is our primary market. The government puts units into the market. Then we have a secondary market. This is where units are traded, sold, bought, and eventually surrendered back to the New Zealand government. So we have traders who are non-participants. So this could be any individual, company, broker, some of the big market movers, banks. And then we also have forest harvestry. So people who receive units for forestry, if they decide to cut down their trees, they have to surrender units. And then our core participants, who are the people who we essentially require under the Act to surrender units back to the government because of the amount of emissions that they produce. Industry recipients as well up top for industrial allocations. This is where you would primarily trade your units, buy them, sell them, and sometimes, which I'll go into a little bit, industrial allocations, you won't have obligations to surrender. So really your secondary market is where you will get the most value from your units. Next slide. So how does the ETS aim to achieve its purpose? So we have 3 key measures. We report a lot of data. We go through a lot of data and we like to collect a lot of data. More data, more information, the more informed we are, which better informs our policy making. We require businesses to surrender emissions, so that's quote unquote a carbon tax essentially, and the surrendering of the units for those who have the largest emissions tonnage per business essentially. And then we're limiting the number of units available to emitters. So over time, we are a declining market cap. So the future is that, in the future, the goal is to lower the amount of units in the market so that we are essentially trying to make businesses more efficient and as efficient as possible so that they will require less units to subsidize their businesses over time.
Can I just interrupt and ask you a question, please?
Sure.
So obviously we're all well aware of the fact that the units are getting reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that the technology that's available for us as industry users is keeping up with the speed in which you're reducing the carbon credits?
What a great question. I personally have no idea. And because who makes the decision? MFE sets the policy. MFE is our Ministry for the Environment. They created the legislation, which is the Climate Change Response Act, which we enforce. So we are the regulators. So we take applications from industry allocations, participants, and we hold the register, which is essentially the bank of units. The policy makers are the government and Ministry for the Environment. MPI, we contract out to take care of our forestry, but MPI, Customs, NZTA as well, all have kind of stake and change the policies. So if they deem what the policy is, potentially they've done research on it. And
obviously you were here when the GNS science lady was speaking before.
yes,
And obviously she's 5 to 10 years away, but currently you're reducing the credits already. So, and I know it's not your role, but I suppose just to make the words here, right?
Yeah. Sure.
It's because I feel as a company that's struggling big time with them.
Yeah.
You know, that we haven't got the technology, or we don't have the options and technology yet.
Sure.
Which somebody needs to go back and tell the right appropriate people, right? So you reckon it's MPI that
It's a collection. So I'm not going to put it all on MPI because that seems unfair.
Whereas New Zealand don't have the technology, you're focusing on geo level.
not just focus
Because
on
when if you go for biomass and other, what the technology is demonstrated.
So that's one option. What I'm saying is that the technology around the options is only relatively new. It takes time. It takes time to review them, look at them, and then also it takes time to find the finance to get those and also install that technology. And that takes years.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So what I'm trying to say is that I think the government's wrong in the fact that they're changing, they're reducing already the credits.
Sure.
I don't think they have a clue.
Sure. This is it's a long-term vision, and it was, because it has been around since 2010 effectively, that in 2020, New Zealand is on target to hit our agreement from the Kyoto Agreement. So we are doing good in that we are reducing our emissions, but I do see your point of, like, from a business perspective, how does this impact you? And we have a long-term strategy, and when he said we, the government has a long-term strategy that is going to potentially take, up to 50 years. The Paris Agreement internationally is they're looking at 2050, right, as a goal. So our New Zealand government is slowly reducing it, but it's reducing it by very small amounts, and we're trying to give people enough step downs, I guess, as we go along. Does that help answer your question? Like, it's a long-term vision, and we're doing very small changes like every year. So within 5 years, you might not see the changes.
Point though, like the conversations by members of government, and GNS is not government, is that the reason that they were interested in the project that we're talking about is recognising the impact of the ETS prices on you guys as a group. So I think it's painful, but it is the leverage point in the discussion that you're having in order to get action. So just think about it. Yeah.
But we're still the only country in the world that has started this. So what's the conversation?
That's not as...
We're in a world economy. Okay, we don't deal. We don't sell ourselves, but
That's not entirely accurate. Like, there's a European market for carbon tax that is thriving.
Which, by the way, has hit the carbon price of $170 a ton of CO2.
But that's it.
Europe. Yeah. So that means, we're talking about almost 3 times prices in New Zealand. It's the carbon price in Europe.
But our closest trading partner doesn't have it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think.
Anyway,
yeah.
Sure, we can talk about it. We can talk about it later. I get the passion, and I get the and I get the wanting to know answers. So specifically relating to you guys here today, we're going to talk about industrial allocations. So if you look at the diagram, this is you up here. So you are receiving units from the government, and you have no obligations under the Climate Change Response Act to surrender units or report on any of your data. You're basically getting free units from the government and as kind of like an incentive, really. And we'll talk about that in the next slide, I think, yeah. So what are industrial allocations? So the government decided that trade, what's the word? Emission intensive and trade exposed, thank you, activities such as growers needed help with the government putting the carbon tax essentially on energy companies. So industrial allocations were a solution. It was like one solution that the government decided to implement, which is the eligibility involves two determinations. That means that you need to be trade exposed. So as growers, you're very much aware that we can import crops from overseas, maybe potentially cheaper if other countries in the, don't have ETS obligations or costs associated with them, and emissions intensive. From touring today, it's a lot of energy to grow in glass greenhouses, and we can recognize that. So the government instilled this calculation, which was your allocation of units, which is a baseline times output times level of assistance. Now, the baseline is determined by the government, and that baseline is calculated on the cost of impact of the emissions intensity of the product. So, like growing tomatoes, it's very high energy. However, it's not as high as, say, I think the 90% was like protein meal. So they calculate a certain number, and that changes after reviews. It's currently in review as well, so that kind of happens every 5 years. Your output is your total production value, annually, and the level of assistance is either 60% or 90%. But as I mentioned before, because we are a declining market cap, it decreases by 0.01% every year until it gets to 30%. So I think it's currently on 0.58. Yep. So which growers are eligible? So fresh tomatoes, fresh capsicum, and fresh cucumbers are mentioned specifically in the Act. So these are the level of assistance, which is 60%, and 60% is meant to cover the cost of the energy costs that we are giving to energy companies, and it's represented in the calculation that the government determines that would offset that cost of energy. The prescribed product, so this is tons annually, and then the allocated baseline you can see is different, again based off that cost impact for each particular crop. So what are the benefits? So as growers, like I said, you do not have any obligations in the ETS to report data or to surrender units to the government. It means that the government are giving you units which you can exchange or trade to do with what you like. That is, I think, our main benefit. So horticulture does not have to surrender units. However, there are industrial processors and participants in forestry harvesting account holders who do have to surrender units, but you do not fall into that category. And because unit allocation is based on your total production value and not on the amount of emissions that you produce, if the incentive is that if you lower your emissions, your number of units is not going to change based on your production. So if you can yield higher production with lower energy costs, the government will still give you the same number of units to cover that total production. We won't ask for evidence of your total emission usage, we just want your production total. So what does the future look like? So as I said, because it is a declining market, these are the calculations that it will decrease over time. So we're talking 2030, and then it will decrease by 0.02 until 2040, and then 0.03 till 2050. And then by 2050, only highly emissions intensive activities will continue to receive allocation. Currently, you are moderately intensive emissions activities, but the MFE is currently proposing a new cabinet paper which will change some of the eligibility of certain crops, certain other activities. So it is constantly in review, and there is a potential change that eligibility over time will change for growers to hit that high emissions intensity because of the amount of energy that you use. So this is no guarantee that this is good news or bad news, it just is news at this stage. Trading and selling, I feel like this is a very big and important one for you guys. So as the diagram suggested, a lot of trading and selling goes on in that secondary market. You need to have an account in the ETS register to trade or sell units. You can trade, sell units to any other account holder. We operate the transaction, so we are the bank, but honestly you can trade to whoever you would like. In order to sell units, there are secondary markets. So as I said before, some banks offer it. There are carbon markets that operate for small traders and units. A lot of other people tend to give their units to their energy provider in exchange for energy. They use units as payment, and because the energy companies are required to surrender their units, so they will take the units, and because they all have accounts, it just makes it easier. But some of the things to consider is that in that secondary market, the government does not currently have control. So the government does not set the price of carbon units, the market does, and it's very demand and supply oriented. So yeah, the government is not responsible, and the secondary markets will usually have the price that they're selling or trading for on their website. But because we are the government and not the secondary market, I can't give you any more accurate advice from that, although I am allowed to speak generally in vague terms. So do we have any questions on this section before Johanna dives into maybe the practical application?
Any tips on where it's going?
Sorry?
Inside trading.
Insider trading? I like my job. No, I literally can't. But if you Google carbon price, yeah, do you want me to repeat anything, or does that all make sense to a certain degree? Great, fantastic. I'll pass it over to Johanna.
Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about the process of how to apply for an industrial allocation, which might be helpful for those of you who don't receive industrial allocations yet. And I will talk a little bit about the different application types and timeframes. Yep. So applications are made via the New Zealand Emissions Trading Register. So for you to apply for an industrial allocation, you need to be registered as an account holder. And the account must be in the name of the legal entity that is carrying out the activity. If you don't have an account yet and you're using the register for the first time, then you need to have a RealMe account and register as a user. Once you're registered, you can open an account with us. I attached a link on that slide as well with some guidance on how to open an account. Yeah, so once your account is open, you can just log into your account, select the ETS activities and industrial allocations, and that's where you can apply for your industrial allocation. That's also where you have to select the application type. So there's two different ways you can choose to receive your units. You can receive units in advance, which is based on what you estimate, estimated production for the year is. But that's also based on your previous year's production. And then you can choose to receive your units on what you actually produced in the previous year. There's a few rules around which application type can or needs to be selected. So if it's your first application or if it's the first year that you produce one of the eligible activities, then you need to apply for a final allocation, and you need the production data from your previous year. You can then also choose, once that application is approved, you can choose to apply for provisional allocation as well, which will give you units in advance for the next year. So as an example, if you apply for a final allocation by the 30th of April, which is the deadline for applications, for your last year's production, and that application is approved by the 30th of April, you can also apply for provisional allocation to get your units for 2023 in advance. Yeah. If you've had an industrial allocation in the past and you would like to apply again for that same product, then the application type depends on what you applied for last year. So if you received a provisional allocation last year, then you need to continue applying for provisional allocation, because you're basically given these units in advance based on what you thought that you were going to produce. If you want to switch to receiving your units based on what you actually produced, you just need to submit an annual allocation adjustment, which is just a square up of the entitlement and your actual production. Final allocations are easy. You can just continue applying for final allocations because you were given the amount of units based on what you actually produced. If you received a provisional allocation and you stop carrying out the activity or you stop producing, then you need to notify the EPA within 20 working days of ceasing to carry out the activity. And you need to submit a closing allocation adjustment in the register, which is like a square up of the units that you were given with what you actually produced. And need to repay any necessary units within the 20 working days. There are some penalties associated with this. So if you received a provisional allocation and you stop producing, then it's really important that you let us know as soon as possible. Just a quick summary about the application types. So provisional allocations, basically you receive units in advance on what you think you're going to produce. Final allocations, you're just given units on your actual production for the year. There's no repayments associated with that. So the units that you received, you can keep them and do with them whatever you'd like to. If you want to switch, then you just submit an annual allocation adjustment to switch back to final allocations. And if you stop producing and you received units in advance, then you just need to notify us within the 20 working days and repay any necessary units within that time frame as well. So once you've selected your application type, you just need to add the activity. So in this example, it's just fresh capsicums. And then you need to just provide us with your production total from last year. When you hit calculate, the system will calculate the number of units that you were received based on your production total. So once the number of units are calculated, you just have to accept the declaration and submit the application. That's when it will come through to us for review. When we get applications, we just check the eligibility so that you're eligible for the allocation that you applied for. The ETS is a self-assessment scheme, so we're not going to ask you to provide any documentation up front. Just if there's a big variance between your last year production and this year, we might ask you for some production records or any other additional supporting documentation. So once the application is approved, you will receive the number of units that you were entitled to. What will you be entitled to in a year? That really depends on the product that you are producing and the production total, so what you produced in the previous year. Sinead already talked about the level of assistance costs and the prescribed allocative baseline. So the allocation is really just calculated by multiplying the level of assistance, the production total in tons, and the allocative baseline. So as an example, if you applied for a final allocation last year, which would have been based on your 2021 production, and you produced 100 tons of fresh tomatoes, then you would have received 153 units. If you apply this year, based on last year's production, and you produced 100 tons of fresh tomatoes, then you would receive 150 units. That reduction is just due to the decrease in the level of assistance, which is being decreased by 1% each year. So the application timeframe for industrial allocations is between the 1st of January and 30th of April each year. If you don't have an account yet, then it would take around 2 to 3 days for you to register in the emissions trading register and open an account. And applications are usually, for industrial allocations, are usually processed within 20 working days. So you only have to submit your application by the 30th. It doesn't have to be approved by then. Yeah, we just added some helpful links as well. We've got some resources on our website around industrial allocations. The Ministry for the Environment has also a lot of helpful information and also updates on any policy changes. And we send out a newsletter every quarter, which also includes any updates or important deadlines. Also, if you are currently receiving industrial allocations and have any questions around your application, or if you are not registered yet but you would like to sign up and want any more help with that or help with opening an account, you can get in touch with our team. And we will be happy to help you with that.
So that's us. So if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, your balance, if you obviously trade year on year, right, you wouldn't surrender all your credits year on year or something like that. But does that balance transfer year on year? Like you have to accumulate?
So units that you have them forever.
Yep.
They don't expire or anything. So you could accumulate units over the past 10 years and just keep them and wait for a good carbon price and then sell them.
It's a bit like Bitcoin, isn't it? So
Yeah, so you get units in your account, the register acts with your bank. There's no interest, but year on year, if you don't take them out or trade them or sell them, then they just stack up, and you have that total year on year.
Steve, to your point, you know that there was only 3 horticultural products there that get the EITE. So it's not leafy greens and what you grow.
No, I was just going to ask who do I apply for. We grow the young plants for those crops.
You don't get any production, unfortunately.
Pardon?
You don't get any production, but they don't ask for the figures.
I know, I was just wondering how often you water it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in.